Okay, welcome all. Today I'm joined by Eric Hacopian, as you all know, but today we'll be discussing some topics around Eric's life, why he moved to Armenia, and what prompted his decision. So, Eric, thanks for coming.
It's a pleasure.
So, Eric, you were born in Iran.
Yes.
You left Iran when? Before or after the revolution?
Before the revolution. The summer of 1978.
Tehran.
Tehran, yeah.
And your family, did they instill Armenianness in you? Did you learn Armenian through them?
Well, we spoke Armenian at home, which is the common in Iran. All the Iranian, our Barskahais essentially speak Armenian at home, so that was not an issue like you have in the West. So obviously, I learned Armenian at home. Armenianness, I wouldn't. We were not a nationalist family. I can say that, but Armenianness was a given. My family background is more, they were all, very left-wing people. So I'm sort of a red diaper baby in that way. But I wouldn't say we were not flag wavers, but, being proud of who you are and where you came from was almost a given.
And then you moved to California. Whereabouts? How was that?
Well, I moved to California when I was 11 years old with my family. We lived in the Hollywood, Los Feliz area, as a lot of Armenians do when they first moved there, back in those days at least. And then I moved to Glendale, where I went to school, which back then was a place of very wide lawns and narrow minds. So I couldn't wait to escape. As soon as I could, I got out of there and went off to UCLA and never went back to live there again.
Perfect. Years later now we're talking, you moved to Armenia. So I want to really understand that. What prompted that decision? Did you plan? Was that in your head for years until you came to that decision?
Well, obviously I have a family and wife and kids, so it was a collective decision. It was not just my decision. But we moved here because it's fundamentally a better place to live.
Okay. Had you spent much time in Armenia before the move?
Yes. The couple of years before we moved here, we were pretty much spending most of the summers here for 2-3 years.
Okay.
So, we were familiarized with living here for longer and ever longer periods of time until 2017 when we actually moved here in the summer of that year.
And do you regret that decision?
Not whatsoever.
Yeah. And how's your family finding life in Armenia?
Well, it's always difficult for kids in their transition because for all practical purposes, they had to move to another country in their early junior high school years or late elementary school years, and you have to suddenly move into another culture and also learn 2-3 other languages at the same time, because even though just like most Armenian American kids, their Armenian was very rudimentary, and for educational purposes, it was zero. So they essentially had to catch up very quickly. And here, in the school that they go to, they actually learn multiple languages. So you're going from one language to learning, Armenian along with German and Russian, and so it was a rather complicated process. It's not all without its ups and downs. It has plenty of that. But overall, it's a good experience for the kids and for everyone in general.
And repatriating is interesting. I know some people that they repatriated, they were determined to stay, but 1-2 years later, they were out. So, what is your advice to people on how to repatriate, but in a good way, in a way that will result in you staying?
It's actually simple. You should only move here if you're going to have a better life here, and if you're going to have a more fulfilling professional career. Obviously there's pay issues and life standard issues, but I would not, don't move here because for patriotic reasons, even though that's always part of the mix. That should not be the driving force. You should only move here if you will have a better life here. That's the only reason to move here.
What were some of the difficulties you faced? Obviously last year the war happened in the fall. How did the war change you? How did it change your views?
Well, the war, I don't think anybody goes through that experience and not be completely transformed. I can say that sort of my, if your world wasn't smashed, then there's something wrong with you. In many ways, it tied me and us in a far greater way to Armenia. But at the same time, what it smashed was my illusions of what I call the American or Western illusions of safety. That what you think is solid, it really isn't, and that the world can be turned upside down in a moment's notice. And we sort of noticed that last year. It wasn't just a war, it was COVID, which I think in the long run is going to have far greater implications than we even imagine today as far as the changes that it's brought about. But it changed, it changed my illusions about how the world works, who's what. I was your standard, U.S. or Western, for lack of a better phrase, leftist, and you find out that there's different categories of victims, and you're not on the favored list of victims. So people you think are going to be standing by you don't.
Yes.
So I think it upended my world in many ways, as it should. But I think it's mostly about, as an American, you have privileges in the sense that your government can do whatever hell it wants around the world, and even if you oppose it, it really doesn't affect you.
Right.
So bad things or evil things done around the world really don't affect you. But on our level, in this level, it really does affect you, even though the protagonist in this case was obviously not the U.S. government. So I think I have a completely different view of the world than I did before, but that's true with almost any traumatic experience.
And back to the U.S., I mean, do you want to move back to the U.S. one day?
No.
No. And what were you doing in the U.S. in terms of work? You worked in politics, in American politics.
Yeah, when I finished school in 1991, actually, from UCLA. Even before that, I was working as an organizer for sort of activist type movements. I worked in a Ralph Nader related organization. I started off as a door-to-door organizer and fundraiser for years. So I'm used to the most basic level of politics. I didn't get into politics with well-connected people giving you internships. I sort of had to fight my way in. And from then on, I sort of just started working campaigns, and essentially that's all I've done up until coming here. And I actually still continue my practice to a far lesser extent just because of time commitments with my clients that I have in Los Angeles. But that led to me opening up my own firm, a consulting firm, in 1997. During that process, I sort of was, despite the fact that most of my clients were not Armenian, I was almost every prominent Armenian elected official in that area is my client, or I know them, or I help them. So it was sort of an Armenian political revival or arrival that I was a part of. But that's been my journey. I mean, it's 35 years of working American politics on pretty much all of its levels.
And I think when we watch some of your interviews, some of your content, you have a degree of skepticism or suspicion of America's role in the world. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but how do you see the state of America today? Do you see America as a lost cause?
Well, I have a tendency, I'm very old-fashioned when I'm a U.S. citizen, and I'm also an Armenian living here, and I don't speak ill of my country when I leave it. So I can just say that I've been skeptical, as any progressive person is, of U.S. foreign policy for years. That's pretty standard. I think, unfortunately, I think the United States is entering a period of sort of existential political problems that are somewhat driven by economic problems that are going to be very difficult to overcome. So I'm not particularly optimistic about the political economic development of that country, and I'm just hoping it doesn't deteriorate to the extent that I fear it might.
Okay, so you don't have high hopes for the future of America.
Well, I'm not sure if I have high hopes for the future of any place, but it's fair to say that.
And in terms of Armenia, one thing that has stuck with me is that you have described Armenia, with the many problems it has, as having an intact social fabric. What do you mean by that when you say that?
Culture. The primary problem, and one of the reasons that the primary problem that are so many of the problems in the West specifically are actually culture wars, culture related. They're not really economic, even though the economics sometimes lead to the culture wars. Or the culture wars are an affront for economic wars. Armenia is, there are no culture wars in Armenia. Everyone knows who they are, where they come from, not necessarily where they're going. But the identity issues, which are the bane of all the fighting in, whether it's in France between immigrants, non-immigrants, whether it's the same thing in the United States between races, ethnicities, that doesn't exist here. Cultural issues are quite settled in many ways, sometimes for good, sometimes for not. But I think there's a tendency in the world to underestimate the importance of culture. I think that's sort of a left-wing bias, to be honest with you, because of the sort of the economic view of development, which is the primary key, but that doesn't happen in a vacuum. And for example, one of the reasons that we came out of this really horrible year without mass bloodshed or civil war like that is because of culture, because there are certain lines you don't cross, certain things you do not do. And culture is a tool. It's a tool for two things. One is to develop your country, and two is to tell your narrative, which is something that we've always been very lacking at, as far as telling a proper story about Armenia and Armenians in general.
Well, it's like when I first came to Armenia in Gyumri in a crowded marshutka, and a Tatik old lady said, "Let me hold your bag." As a Londoner, I thought she was trying to mug me at first. I mean, I didn't get the trust culture at first. So you were already living here in Armenia when the revolution happened in 2018. I mean, you even said earlier that you had leftist ideology in some sense. So what did you think at the time when this happened?
Well, interestingly enough, for those couple of months, I actually had come back for work. So actually, during the actual revolution, I was not here. We were following everything, and we came back soon afterwards. So I actually missed the main event, but obviously we followed it. What do I make of it? It was a remarkable thing. Remarkable on two sides, that you push this people, this nation far enough, they will act. And, to quote Lenin, he said that sometimes for decades nothing happens, and sometimes in weeks decades happen, and that's what happened. And people said, "The hell with this," and they overthrew the order with very little violence and almost no bloodshed. And this also goes to the credit of the old regime that was not willing to shed blood to stay in power. And I think people don't like to credit them, but they needed to be credited for that, because they could have easily gone the other way. Some other leader, some other characters, it would have been different. So I think it was a remarkable moment. And I think looking back at it in hindsight, we should have seen that this was inevitably going to lead to war, given the fact that almost every revolutionary country gets attacked just because of the turmoil, the political ups and downs of the country, or the inexperience of the new leaders. We didn't see that coming. But listen, at the end of the day, I'm convinced that there was an element of the war last year that had to do with the fact that people are not happy with the fact that we are this little island of freedom, that and democracy and human rights in a very, very unfree part of the world. And you're a bad example. And I think there's a level of that neglect that I think was driven by that, not necessarily by the Western powers, but certainly by other powers.
And let's talk a bit about the diaspora. I mean, I think even with the war, perceptions of Armenia, of Armenianness, of Armenians. You know, everyone is kind of reviewing, reflecting on what they think. But did you notice that there really is a difference between the perception of these things between diasporans and native Armenians, people here?
Oh, absolutely. But I mean, and what do you mean? And specifically, I mean, there's obviously differences in experience, but what specifically are you referring to?
I mean, even your interview with Pukhov, with Ruslan Pukhov, he was talking about this idea of a theme park.
Oh, no. I think there's all of my broadcasts have always been very critical of the diaspora, as much as I'm critical of state actors here, because they never took building a state seriously. For 30 years, we should have been focused on building a state. All the things that people are working on right now, think tanks, reform, bringing in diasporas into ministries, this all should have been 30 years ago.
Yeah,
we wasted 30 years, primarily because of the political system here. But let's be honest, there were many people in the diaspora that were quite comfortable with the old regime, with the corruption. Unfortunately, some of them actually even took part in that corruption. So I think there's the diaspora's approach to Armenia was always wrong. Armenia was a theme park, and the biggest ride on the theme park, the final theme, was Artsakh. And on some level, I'm not saying there were many people who their perception was shut up and be happy what you have, and we have Artsakh, and you know, we've defeated the Azeris, we've defeated the Turks, and we should be happy about that, and not care about the political economic development of the country, which was foolish. Yeah. So I think that attitude I'm very critical of. And anything that's condescending, because I think people, not that people here are perfect, trust me, they're not, but you cannot sit in judgment of people here unless you walked in their shoes. So I think overall, even though there's been really pockets of excellence coming from the diaspora, we all know the names. For the most part, systematically, our diaspora has been a failure.
Yeah. And what do you think generally of Armenian politics? You have experience in American politics, but you follow the politics of different countries around the world. What do you think when I say that phrase, Armenian politics?
Well, I mean, politics in every country in the 70th, 80th percentile is, you know, it's entertainment for ugly people. I mean, it's just, it's something where, you know, normally average, mediocre people have a way to become more relevant than they would be in other walks of life, many times because they can't succeed in other walks of life. So you essentially have the same, I mean, you think our guys are bad, you should see the idiots in the United States Congress. I mean, there's some doozies there. I've been in meetings with some of them where they'll fall asleep in the middle of it. So you're not really dealing with the best and the brightest for the most part in the political systems. So we have the same category of mediocrities, a few brilliant people, rogues, and some idiots, except it's all in Armenian.
And would you say Armenia is a democracy?
Armenia is far more than a democracy. Armenia is one of the freest countries in the world. That's the thing that people don't realize.
Why? You mean in terms of the freedom to express, the freedom?
Armenia is... you can make a very compelling case that Armenia is more free than the West, as far as freedom of speech goes. I mean, hell, there's no
cancel culture.
There's no cancel. Well, actually, everyone is involved in canceling each other, but it's done openly.
But next week they're fine with each other.
Yeah, and then and we don't do microaggressions here. We just do major aggressions. So this is the thing. I think that people, you know, we have this tendency to highlight things that we're really not very good at, and then we miss what we're really good at. And one of the best things about this country is this is one of the freest countries in the world. Not just in simple political expression, but just in the way people approach life. We don't do idols, you know? I think there was one post-independence politician that had a statue made from him, and that was Nikol Pashinyan in Tavush, and then he was beheaded. So if you try to make Armenians convinced to worship some, alcoholic fascists like Ataturk, good luck. It's not going to happen.
Yeah.
We don't do idols. We're idol breakers.
And the statues in the streets are of poets, painters, musicians. Yeah. So personally, my perception of Armenia changed a lot when I came and I met young guys who were preparing to go serve, had served, or were serving at the time. I feel that diasporans have an inherent privilege, which many of them do not really take into consideration. And also when you speak about the freedom of speech thing, maybe partly the diaspora in the West is applying those things that's going on in Western political discourse and applying it to Armenia. And that's the reason partly for the hoo-ha. I mean, so what would your advice be to, young people who haven't spent much time in Armenia, don't know much about Armenia? How would you tell them to approach Armenia in an intelligent way?
Non-emotionally. Forget about the two mountains, the river and the two trees. Those things, just put them. Armenia is a country. It's a real place. It's a real place with real problems. It's a real place for real possibilities. Now it's becoming a country of real opportunity. Perhaps even more so than some places in the West, just because of the cost entry of getting into different things from a business perspective. And I think, by the way, we're going to look back, and Armenia is going to be one of the big winners of this post-COVID changes because of the way the nature of work and things that are happening. I think part of the economic development, the acceleration we see here is because so much of things during COVID actually moved online, which has been quite helpful to us. And we're not really quantified it yet, but you see it in the people's lives and who does what and for what purpose, and how people's income levels are frankly rising and their ambitions are rising along with that. I think you should have a non-emotional look of this place. Don't go into that black hole of negativity. It's a different place. And you have to also understand you will never be part of it on some level, which is the difficult thing. You talk about privilege of diaspora. The primary privilege of diaspora is that you can leave.
Yeah, exactly.
But the primary privilege of being a local is that everyone you know is here. Your world is here. And you'll never be an outsider.
Yeah.
No one's going to say your kids are Titis Americatis in school. So I think these privileges go both ways. But I think you need to approach this place unemotionally, in the sense that you need to put your emotions in the background and focus on practical things, understand what's possible, understand how people are going to perceive you. Some are going to like you, some will love you, few will hate you, and some will go, what the hell are you doing here? Who the hell moves here from Paris or Los Angeles or London? And frankly, those are conversations that, depending on the level of person, you can never win. Because if you're talking to a taxi driver who thinks that he can make $15,000 a month driving Uber in Los Angeles, then good luck. So what I've learned living here is that as far as the United States goes, there's actually two United States. There's the real version and then the taxi driver version.
Okay.
And so the taxi driver version, it's like an adult Disneyland where you're given, and every day is Halloween. So
okay. And what about your sense of hope? Do you have hope in Armenia? And after the war, in that period of time, were there moments where you were kind of shaky? Was your hope shaken?
No. Why? Because I was here. I was in America when COVID started, and I was here when the war started, and I saw who handled what better. There's no reason to. People don't lose their shit here very easily.
Yeah.
And they're a lot tougher, frankly.
Yeah.
Than us diasporans. No, that was never in the equation.
And you've been doing work, interviews, the Insights show with CivilNet, all in English, of course. But what do you think about your time at CivilNet now, looking back in hindsight?
Well, I mean, it's just, I mean, it's immensely rewarding in the sense that one of the good things about Armenia is there's no, in Armenia, there's no contradiction between being and becoming. And what I mean by that is you're not working or planning for 7 years to get something done. What you do today has an impact tomorrow.
Mm-hmm.
So to the extent that what I've done has had any impact, it's personally gratifying. I don't know if it has, but that's for other people to judge. But overall, it's personally, it's a gratifying experience.
Mm. And do you have a favorite interaction with a fan or a hater, someone coming up to you in the street?
I don't know if you can. Well, I mean, the best interaction I ever had was from a woman who was not Armenian, was not even caring about Armenian issues, and she wrote me on Facebook saying, "I thought you were related to an asshole that I dated in San Juan Capistrano until I found out you're not." But she felt compelled to write me. So that's the funniest thing. Actually, came from a non-Armenian.
Good, I mean.
No, there's plenty of interaction, mostly positive. There's a consistent, wingnut factor from what I call the Bermuda Triangle of lunacy, which is, if you know Los Angeles, is from like Glendale to Tujunga to North Hollywood. Almost 90% of the craziest things you will get will be from that Bermuda Triangle.
And some people have criticized maybe or described you as idealistic and have used that word, idealistic.
Who?
I mean, I'll get the names for you next time.
Yeah.
But what do you say to that? Number one, do you agree? Do you think you're idealistic? And number two, what would you say to them?
Idealistic in the sense that I have ideals or things that are
guess
principles.
Perhaps.
Yes, I mean, yeah. I mean, yeah, I'm not. But my worldview is generally quite negative and cynical. So I don't know where they get that.
Maybe it's not negative and cynical enough for them. Perhaps that's what it is.
It could be. I mean, listen, I think and this is a consistent thing, and I think we need to deal with it. There's a group of people out there who have a vested interest in negativity in Armenia.
Mm-hmm.
And this is not just simply political. It's also very personal.
Yeah.
Because people somehow, and I've gotten this, diasporans somehow feel you're passing judgment on them by moving here, and when they haven't. And there's no such thing. Everybody needs to do what they need to do for their own purposes. And I think there's also this tendency among people from Armenia that have left here in the last 30 years, is that there's a group of them, a subgroup of them, they're not a majority, that you cannot convince of anything positive here. Because they have a mental, psychological vested interest in negativity. And I understand that. Because in truth, most people who leave Armenia, in most places that they're at, are living hand to mouth. Now, I think living hand to mouth in Paris or Los Angeles is different than living hand to mouth in Yerevan, because the standards of living are much higher.
Yeah.
But a lot of the distraction, a lot of the negatives really come, people have a vested interest in negativity here. I mean, there's obviously a political motive with that too,
Of course.
But I shouldn't say good news. Positive developments in Armenia are generally underreported, partly because many of the positive stories in Armenia are actually economic related or business related. I mean, if you know the questions that I got when we were in Los Angeles, your hair would stand up. People are asking if there's enough food.
Yeah.
They don't understand that, there's parts of Yerevan that have a better restaurant scene than parts of Los Angeles.
Yeah.
And that's the truth. So there's an underreporting of positive news because there's an underreporting of business news, because there's plenty of bad political news, there's plenty of bad military news. That's across the board. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, you have to cut out these people that have a vested interest in negativity, not give them enough attention. Too much attention.
Okay, Eric. Now I want to do a short fire round, word association. I'm going to go through some phrases, some names even. And you say what comes to mind. It doesn't have to be short, can be long. We have some time. So we've done Armenian politics. So let's start with the Prime Minister, Nikol Pashinyan.
Never has this country produced a better political talent that spent all of his life thinking about how to overthrow the old regime and spent 5 minutes thinking about what he does afterwards.
And what about Robert Kocharian, former president Robert Kocharian?
Probably the most tragic figure in Armenian post-independence history. Because the consistent thing with him is he was always smart enough to know better. And instead of uplifting, because he's a very sophisticated figure, he's actually smart, very worldly, cynical, tough, mean, but he could have done a lot more by uplifting the political discourse and the political system here, and he fell into the trap of wealth and a comfortable life.
And what about Serge Sargsyan, the third president?
His biggest sin wasn't that he was corrupt. His biggest sin was that he was lazy, and we wasted 10 complete years with him, far more so than the 10 years with Kocharian.
And quite a, I would say, mysterious figure almost in Armenian politics. What about first president, Levon Tepetosyan?
He's the smartest man to lead the country and one with the least amount of self-reflection or inspection or reflection of who he is and where he comes from. He's, political figures tend to become like caricatures of themselves. And, the best way to describe him, he's become the bad in-law from an Armenian, family fight where they're obsessed about who made what speech 30 years ago and how they didn't mention his name. And him and some of the people around him are obsessed about being right in 1997.
Yeah.
When one, they weren't right, and two, they couldn't convince anyone that they were right. So the whole political essence has become how I was right then and everyone else was wrong, rather than any self-reflection. The oligarchic system in Armenia was first established by him, not by him, but by people around him. And he's the one who handpicked Robert Kocharian to take his place to solidify that oligarchic system. But there's no self-reflection on these people. He's the one whose idea it was to turn the country into an agricultural country, which was ridiculous on the face of it. He had the arrogance of an intellectual, the brains of an intellectual. So in many ways, he was quite brilliant, but he also had the pitfalls of your typical intellectual that in a normal situation would never be in a position to run a country.
What about, not in parliament anymore, but a major figure in Armenian politics, Gagik Tsarukyan, tycoon, head of the Prosperous Armenia Party?
Fashionista.
Icon.
Nah, I think, he's quite underestimated. He's actually a lot smarter than people think.
Yeah.
He understood the street and the sort of the directions of the country much better than other people. And frankly, he very smartly, not that business people really don't need to be in politics, got out of politics. And now it's back to his business and making a lot of money. Now that you don't really need to be in parliament to protect your assets. So I think people have a tendency to underestimate him because of obvious reasons. But he's a lot smarter than people think he is.
And in terms of some non-Armenian figures, what do you think of Ilham Aliyev?
Insecure.
Yeah.
I think he must at every day at some point think what he would have been if his father was not the first king of Azerbaijan. I mean, what would he must think like, what would I be? Would I be a teacher in Sumgait? Would I be a gas station attendant in Nakhchivan? And I think there's a level of insecurity there. And I think he's more insecure than anything.
Yeah. What about Turkey's president, Recep Tayyip Erdogan?
He's the most dangerous fascist or political figure in the face of the world today. Because if you look at his project, which was just essentially an Islamic version of Kemalism, it's a failed political project. It's already failed. It's just a question of the ramifications of the failure. And those failures are primarily economic. You know, his country's getting poorer and becoming more of a basket case every day. But there are, at the same time, no more dangerous figures in the world than failed messianic figures. Because they think of themselves as far more important than they are, and they can do dramatically destructive things. And I think what we got from him last year, a good part of Eastern Mediterranean might get from now till 2023.
Okay, some non-names now. What do you think about the state of diplomacy, Armenian diplomacy?
It would be a great invention.
What about the Armenian church?
You really want to get me into trouble. What I think about the Armenian church, I think about, you know, in the Christian religion, there's this idea that Jesus Christ is going to come back. So I just imagine him coming back with a clipboard one day, knocking on the doors of Echmiadzin and with a list of questions. You know, are they prepared to answer him or not? Use your imagination.
What about Armenian oligarchy, all the different oligarchs?
Yesterday's news.
Media, Armenian media.
It's a mix and match of, I mean, yeah, frankly, as nowadays, it's actually a lot like world media.
Yeah.
Because you have the few, you know, respectable places that you can get reliable information. Then you have state media, which is, it is what it is. It presents the government view. And then there's the opposition media, which is the Armenian version of Fox, in which, you know, they sensationalize everything. And then there's just complete, utter insanity on social media where anything goes.
Super similar to America.
Very much. No, this is the media model is actually here is becoming very much like the rest of the world. Actually, like the Western world, because we actually have some of the freest media, actually, you know, and quite irresponsible media in some ways, in the sense that the anti-COVID vaccination thing kills people here every day. We lose 50 to 60 people a day because of lies, stupidity, and just asinine craziness that these people spread on social media to drive people crazy. And to this day, I do not understand what purpose it serves, because it doesn't really serve anyone's political purpose unless you just want to create chaos.
Yeah. There's also a dislike of media and journalists in some sectors.
That's true anywhere. Because if media is popular, they're not doing their job.
I like to think everyone loves journalists.
No. It's, you should be somewhere in there, you know, one step above politicians.
What about the Caucasus? What do you think of our neighborhood?
It's one of the least important parts of the world where everyone in it is convinced that they're in the center of history.
Okay. What about the peace between Armenia and Azerbaijan? I mean, there are rumors at the moment that on November 9th, there is going to be another agreement. Many people are also worried that once that happens, we're going to see, you know, politics and temperatures rise. So what do you think?
Well, I actually did a show on this yesterday.
Yep.
Ultimate peace, you know, you cannot have ultimate peace without a level of justice. And I do not see substantial long-term peace minus two things: the democratization of Azerbaijan, and more importantly, the sort of the denazification of their society as far as just organized hatred. And given that their national identity is to a great extent based on hatred of Armenians, I just don't see how peace is possible in the short run with a state whose essential zeitgeist is a hatred of Armenians and nothing else, because it really has nothing else to give its people, because it's failed them almost every other way.
And do you think Armenians are ready for peace? I mean, Armenians also have their perception of Azerbaijan, and Azerbaijan is...
Armenians are more ready for peace, but not in any terms. Again, in terms of justice or some level of justice, yeah, they're ready for peace. And this is a far freer. I think we should stop ever comparing these societies against each other. Not that people as human beings are not equal, or as human beings, these two sides are equal. But you're talking about a free democratic state with many faults and a backwards, Middle Eastern sultanate, with a racialist neo-fascist ideology as its core essence. So these two states cannot be compared. Which side is ready for what? Because you're comparing apples to oranges.
And do you think Armenia, I mean, this is a topic that really interests me, and you spoke a bit about it earlier, but do you see Armenia and Armenians in general as quite a classist society?
Very much so.
And how do you think that manifests?
I think this is
because I say this also because I think a lot of people, when they come to Armenia from foreign countries, they don't know much about Armenia. They don't notice.
No. You have to live here to notice it, because the class system in Armenia is the Soviet hierarchy that's been corrupted. Yeah. Because since there was no quote unquote wealth, even though there were pockets of corruption, you could not be an open millionaire and have some ugly villa somewhere off the road. For the most part. Soviet elitism was based on education and access. So you actually had some kind of an order in which, on some level, the best educated people had the most prestigious job. Now, the best educated people are not necessarily the best people to run the country, but that's besides the point. There was a natural order of things. You had the better education, you had the better vacation home, you had the more pay, even though it was fairly not unequal, and as it is right now. But it was a hierarchy of education and culture. And what changed is that moral order was turned upside down by having a mercantile class, but this was not a normal mercantile class. It was a semi-criminalized mercantile class that became the head of society. And so you had these people who spent, years doing their work, and suddenly their pensions are worthless. Their wages are worthless, and you have these very marginal people who could have been, janitors or street cleaners, suddenly become the leaders of the country, or very, very wealthy, based on things that were not on their accomplishments. So people have a tendency to underestimate how traumatic, especially outsiders, especially diasporans, the collapse of the Soviet Union was a tragedy for the lives of most people. Now, you can say that very few people want to go back to it now. 20 years ago would have been different. If you talk to young people today, no one wants to go back to that period. You would have to really go above 50 to get anyone with nostalgic about the Soviet period.
Sure.
But people's lives were smashed. And there's a little, there's this thing that Putin always gets criticized for, because he said the collapse of the Soviet Union is the greatest tragedy in history. But anybody who's tried to recreate it is crazy. They always don't say the second part of it, where whoever said he wants to recreate it is crazy. But he said but in reality, if you talk to ordinary people, that was a tragedy. You went from somewhat of a lower income, some kind of a normalized lifestyle to complete chaos.
Yeah.
Factories closing. This was an industrial country that became industrialized. Imagine if all of the United States was Detroit.
Yeah.
And then you have a war, and then you have. So I think there's a tendency not to appreciate how people's lives were smashed and what effect that people had. What effect that had on people.
Apart from the Armenian Soviet experience, what do you think in general of the Soviet Union and that political experiment that was the Soviet Union?
Well, I come from a family of, grandparents and things that was the ideal for them. But obviously, in hindsight, it was a failed messianic experience. And it was a failed messianic system that could not work,
Right.
fundamentally. And failed as soon as you try to reform it in a serious manner. And but that doesn't mean during that time or process people didn't live their lives, that they didn't have their careers, and people were educated. You cannot say good things did not happen during that period. Armenia was a nation of orphans in 1920, and by 1991 it was an educated, industrialized country.
Yeah.
That was secure and had a chance to revive itself outside of the most traumatic experience in Armenian history. So I think you need to be sort of cold-heartedly realistic about what happened. But was the system itself workable? No. I think fundamentally, in hindsight, there were existential issues with it, and it was eventually going to not survive in that context.
And in terms of Armenian politics, many use the word personalities, personalized nature of Armenian politics. And we mentioned the four men who really dominated Armenian politics all these years. There is no real spectrum, in a sense, like in Europe where we say left wing, right wing. I mean, can you explain that a bit? And do you think that Armenia should move towards a reality where politics is based on ideology?
Absolutely, it should move there, but the world is actually following Armenia. The world is not following Armenia, but ideological politics is collapsing in that sense. That politics now in most of the democratic world is about the ins and the outs. It's about the elites against the anti-elites, and the anti-elites and the elites are both left and right.
Yeah.
You see it all over the world. In France, you have Eric Zemmour. It's going to be a very, it's like the French Trump. At the same time, like in the United States, you have the Bernie Sanders. You have essentially, in the same way that the Soviet system was failing, fundamentally the Western democratic system that was established after 1991 and the sort of the neoliberal model, is fundamentally failing, which is driving all these political crises and bringing out all these populist figures. So, yes, Armenian politics should be driven on ideological lines and not on stupid personal, I love this guy, I hate that guy. And then there's also no gray area. Like, you can be for this prime minister and be very critical, and you can be for Robert Kocharyan and be very critical of the system that he created. There's no nuance here.
Yeah.
That's the biggest difference, is the lack of nuance. But unfortunately, personalization of politics is the norm now around the world. It's really not. So I don't see how we make that transition when that system is ceasing to exist in the most important countries in the world.
Yeah, but if we take Armenia, I mean, if it's going to be the pro-elite and anti-elite dynamic, surely the anti-elite will win every time in Armenia.
Yeah, but the elite will change.
Yeah.
It's very likely that in a few years, Armenia is owned by a tech oligarchic elite. Those are the most likely owners of the country 4 or 5 years from now.
Sure.
Because that's where the wealth is being created, and that old wealth is just going to wilt compared to the scale of what these guys are going to, or gals are going to have. This country is going to be transformed in ways in the next 5-10 years that it hasn't in the last 30.
Yeah, I mean, where do you see Armenia in 10 years?
I think barring major wars or geopolitical earthquakes in the world, I think this is going to be a far more affluent country than it is now, and developed in many more ways. So I think one of the things about these economic engines, once they sort of start, they're very hard to screw up. They sort of have a momentum of its own. Every day you wake up and there's some new venture that you never even imagine who these people are, where they came from, what are they doing. You had a show on Koreans starting a business here that's doing outsourcing stuff from Korea. There's just so much of that stuff. It's not, you can't even keep track of it. And I think the one story that people are missing is sort of the labor migration here, which is going to transform this country in many ways. and I don't think the society is ready for it.
Ready for it in the sense of having foreigners coming and living?
Large numbers. Yeah.
Why is that?
Because it's a very
homogenous.
Yeah, it's a very homogenous place.
Yeah.
I think they'll be embraced by people with higher incomes, and they'll be resented by people with lower incomes because there'll be competition.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, Armenian society is tolerant in really weird ways. Mm-hmm. People will essentially leave you alone for the most part. Yep. You know, they might think you're weird, is whatever, but no one's going to go out of their way to make your life miserable. So we have this tolerance, but the word is tolerance and not acceptance.
Yes.
So I think people will tolerate a lot. Doesn't mean that they'll like it.
Or do something about it. I mean, someone was telling me the other day that Armenians can be the sort of people that may bark, but for them to go and do something.
No, they won't. No, they talk a lot. They do very. Yeah. I mean, they're not. This is not
Iran. For example.
I mean, you take like let's just take LGBT rights for example. In many ways, for example, in Russia, you can actually be freer as a gay person than you can in Armenia. However, with few exceptions, there's almost no sort of systematic violence against LGBT people as long as they don't make a spectacle of themselves. Now, I think people should be able to live as they want. Obviously, I'm not saying that it's a good thing, but that's a difference.
Yeah, it's an interesting.
You're not physically threatened. Mm-hmm. People don't love you. They don't want the kids to be you. But if two women are living together in a building, everyone will, say something on the side, but they're never going to do anything or even say something in your face in many cases.
And people are also talking a lot about how the mentality of Armenians is changing, is evolving. Some people use the word Europeanize or modernize, but I'm not a big fan of that. But what do you think? How do you think Armenians are changing in terms of their attitudes, in terms of their approaches?
Well, all of this is driven by economic changes. And what this is it's Armenia is a very traditional family structure. Mm-hmm. Where the father is the titular head, is the president, but the actual household is run by the prime minister, who's the mom or the wife, who has the real power in many ways, or makes the important decisions on a daily basis.
Yeah.
But what happens to that social order, where as we see this every day, there are more and more people in their 20s that make 5-10 times more than their parents.
Yeah. Educated.
Yeah. How do you tell you're a traditional father who's 60 years old? How do you tell your 25-year-old daughter not to go live with her boyfriend when she's paying for your rent or paying for your car? So in some ways, those changes are good. In some ways, it's the sort of upends the moral order. But those changes are here.
So you think it's economics really driving that change?
Yeah, very much so. And the other thing, which is very unique, is that since so much of the better paying jobs are tech,
the
tech world is very non-hierarchical in its basic structures. So you have, and women are way overrepresented in tech in Armenia than they are in other countries. I shouldn't say overrepresented because they're still less than 50%, but for example, in Silicon Valley, women's participation in tech is like 18%. In Armenia is like 36 to 38. Mm-hmm. It's the highest in the world, actually. And so you have people that are the influencers, decision makers, who are working in places in which women are equal. There's no hierarchy. The hierarchies are far less structured. And they're making more money than their very conservative parents. In the long run, that is... this is a very rapidly changing society. If you came to Armenia 20 years ago, you would never see, first of all, you would never see non-diasporans in a restaurant. That would be quite rare. Or you would never see 6 professional women on their nights out as their husbands are watching their babies.
Yeah.
And that you see here all the time.
Or a woman having a beer or something in a bar.
Or, and frankly, women having professional women now, it's quite acceptable to have children out of without being married. Because people don't like to talk about it, but it's out there.
Yeah.
If you have enough money, no one's going to say anything. So this society is changing in many ways. In fact, it's actually changing far more dramatically than places like some places in Los Angeles, which are sort of stuck in this time capsule of Armenianness that no longer exists in Armenia.
Yeah, I mean, some people say that the year an Armenian migrates from Armenia, from wherever they come from, is the year they kind of stay in their idea.
No, there's a time warp, and that Armenia no longer exists.
Yeah,
in reality. I mean, it exists in certain places. You drive far enough, and there's countries like Armenia tend to be very capital centric, but then again, anything that matters happens here, and social change essentially, it's the elites or the upper middle class people that essentially force their lifestyle and their social beliefs on everybody else. No, but this is the norm all around the world, actually.
Quite a capitalist society, fair to say.
I would say a very mercantilist society. Capitalist is a different thing.
Okay.
I think people are very business-minded here, in which everyone wants to. That's part of the sort of the anarchist collective of everyone wants to have. We're a nation of shopkeepers.
Yep.
But Greece is sort of like that too. But then the shopkeepers will, unlike in the United States, where every shopkeeper thinks they're going to be the next Walmart. Here, people will resent the really wealthy rich guy.
Yeah.
So you have this. You can have small business people that have views that, if you filter them, can be quite left wing. So you have this really weird dichotomy. But it's a very mercantile. I mean, this is a business culture. Armenians are merchants. This is like almost buy, sell, make money. And I think, frankly, part of the growth that we've had, or the economic revival, especially after the war, is the fact that the one thing that the revolution did is to lift that dead hand of the oligarchy and the feudal system that we had in rural areas out of people's lives. And if you leave Armenians alone, I mean, you take almost any Armenian community anywhere in the world, and I can't think of one in which Armenians in it don't have higher income than other native people living in that country. Mm-hmm. That's a consistent pattern all over the world. And the only places Armenians weren't succeeding in business was in Armenia up until now. Which, by the way, people love to compare Armenia to Israel in so many ways, which is a completely ridiculous comparison.
Okay.
But people tend to forget that Israel, for its first 30, 35 years of its existence, was a complete economic basket case with inflation figures that were in the thousands. People were routinely leaving the country en masse, as other people were coming in that were more poor or desperate. So, and in some ways, we've sort of turned this economic corner essentially 30 years after independence, which is somewhat correlates with their experience. But now the sort of the Armenian mercantilist hand is free to manifest itself along with, political freedom. And it actually, mercantilist societies, they can be very right-wing, but it's hard to make them, where there's enough people that have money, it's very hard to be totalitarian.
Yeah. I mean, people are in favor of welfare here. I mean, they would want it if they could have.
So there's a social democratic tradition here.
Yeah.
There's a strong social democratic tradition that's never gone away. I mean, you can, I don't think people want to recreate some Western neoliberal model here. That's not what what they want is to be free to do business, but at the same time, a social democratic state in the sense that it takes care of the weakest and the poorest. And it's a just society. I think that's the thing that this is justice in the sense that I think this was one of the reasons that one of the biggest sins of the old regime is that they destroyed the sense of social solidarity and coherence that the sort of people are willing to sacrifice. I mean, let's take Victory Park. If you ever want to understand the symbolic nature of what the old regime represented socially and culturally is the fact that they cut down trees in Victory Park that were planted by World War II widows for their husbands to make really ugly homes for the gendered oligarchs. That one act tells you all you need to know. If you're willing to cut down trees planted by widows who were probably your grandmother, what values do you have?
Well, Eric, this was very insightful. Thank you as always.
Thank you.
Okay then, and thank you for joining us on this podcast with CivilNet.